This program, Russia-Ukraine Foreign Policy and Morality, was presented by Richard A. Mathisen on June 3, 2025 at the Lehigh Valley Active Life Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Copyright 2025.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to Russia-Ukraine Foreign Policy and Morality. My name is Richard Mathisen. But today my topic is foreign policy, the foreign policy of the United States for over 100 years since World War I, and the foreign policy of Russia for over 1,000 years. Russia has been an authoritarian state for over 1,000 years, as we'll find out. The United States was involved in 3 world wars in the 20th century. It won all 3 of them, thankfully. But it had to decide at the end how to deal with the defeated adversaries. And if you'll pardon my generalizations, after World War I, our foreign policy was terrible. After World War II, our foreign policy was brilliant. And after the end of the Cold War, there are major questions that we're going to be talking about today. So this presentation has 5 parts. Part 1 is the United States treatment of defeated adversaries after world wars. That's after World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, which I often call World War III. My main interest is U.S. foreign policy towards Russia at the end of the Cold War, meaning our policy towards Russia under Boris Yeltsin from 1991 to 2000. In a previous lecture, a gentleman asked the question, was there anything we could or should have done differently during that period? And that's really what this presentation is about, and we'll see. If you accept my generalization that Russia had been an authoritarian state for 1,000 years, then Russia, in 1991, under Boris Yeltsin, as a nation with a large army and navy and a huge number of nuclear weapons, needed to be treated very carefully, or so it can be argued. And the question is how well we did. So that's part 1 of my presentation about U.S. foreign policy towards defeated adversaries after winning the world. That'll be the first thing I talk about. Part 2, definitions will be very short. I want to define 2 visions of U.S. foreign policy. One is realism, and the other is idealism. As you will quickly discover, I am a strong proponent of realism and a frequent critic of idealism. This is just full disclosure. I'm not interested in debating the topic, but I want to at least be clear about my position. Part 3 will be on the Cold War. This is somewhat personal. I lived through it. I want to establish the main points regarding foreign policy as clearly as I can. And after part 3, I will take a few short questions in case I've been unclear, just so you can clear it up. Questions, I hope not statements, preferably short questions, because I have a lot of material to cover today. Part 4 will be a history of Russia and in the context of the history of civilization. Why is Russia authoritarian? Why is Russia so fearful of invasions to the point of being paranoid? And I will express my opinion that Russia tends to be almost paranoid. And how does Russian history differ from the history of Western nations such as the United States? After part 4, I'll again take questions. And then in the final part, I'll look at United States policy decisions during the Boris Yeltsin period of 1991, 2000, and the early 2000s. So, and in part 5, I'll draw heavily from a book by a true Russia expert, and this is Professor William Hill. It's entitled No Place for Russia because this period is complicated, and in fact, there's the book, Professor William Hill, No Place for Russia. He's arguing basically that US policy could never figure out what to do with Russia. And I think that's a fair assessment of what happened, for better or for worse. All right, are ready? Part one, US foreign policy toward defeated adversaries. And in World War I, let me see if I can get this working. That was Great Britain, France, and Italy, as well as Russia at the beginning, against Germany and Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So, at the end of the war, people were pretty convinced that Kaiser Wilhelm II was the main cause, and Woodrow Wilson wanted to promote democracy everywhere, even where it might not belong, because he was very much an idealist. And at the Versailles Treaty, the result was severe punishments for Germany and breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And German reparations caused hyperinflation in Germany. Those are all bills. And Germany's hyperinflation went from 1 mark to the dollar to 1 trillion marks to the mark, trillion paper marks to 1 gold mark. And that caused hyperinflation. Again, those are all bills. And it wiped out the savings of the middle class. And then, of course, that was followed by the Great Depression in 1929, which led eventually to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And I suggest to you, to the extent that United States foreign policy allowed France in particular to force massive reparations to be assessed against Germany and encouraged democracies and states with little preparation for democracy, it may have played a part in creating World War II. That's my opinion. Okay, World War II. Afterwards, the US treatment of defeated adversaries after World War II. I would say this was brilliant. We rebuilt West Germany, rebuilt Japan, Marshall Plan for Europe, created the United Nations, created NATO. And that was under President Harry Truman. That's the United Nations. The Marshall Plan, that's General Marshall. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And we also had a very low tariff policy and free trade, which was a very good idea at the time. Now you'll find that many people feel we've kept it on too long, and that's what's going on in our country right now. But at the time, this was excellent foreign policy. And at the end of the war, very shortly thereafter, Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech on March 5th, 1946. That's barely about 6 months after the war. People did not take it seriously at first, but Stalin was very aggressive, and this was what the Iron Curtain looked like. You can see that's Russia, and that's the various countries Russia was already controlling. That's the Iron Curtain. And then this is what we came to call as the free world. The United Kingdom, France, Austria, West Germany. So that was the start of the Cold War, which lasted until December 25th, 1991, 45 years by my counting. US defending the free world against the Soviet Union. And now we're going to look at the treatment of defeated adversaries after the Cold War. So there's the fall of the Berlin Wall. Boris Yeltsin elected president in a pretty democratic election. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned December 25th. And there were now 14 new nations. The Soviet Union had been 15 nations, And you can see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. Ukraine is much bigger, but this is Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And then the stands, they're called Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Now, you have them all memorized, I'm sure. Okay. Well, anyway, that's, they were all newly created, and of course the one we're especially interested in is Ukraine. And this was all done at the end of the Cold War under President George H.W. Bush, Bush 41. And I call this his trifecta. The fall of the Berlin Wall, freeing the satellites, the victory in the Gulf War, removing Iraq from Kuwait, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War. 3 fantastic achievements, and his result was to get replaced by Bill Clinton, because his domestic policy was not necessarily appreciated. But I am still amazed that one president could do all those things in a short term. So Boris Yeltsin was elected president, and the treatment of defeated adversary after the end of the Cold War is the question mark that we're going to be talking about, because there was obviously the fall of the Berlin Wall, freedom for the satellites, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, 14 new nations, and there's also Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia started falling apart immediately, and that's 6 republics within it. And so we had all these 14 new nations from the Soviet Union and another 6 from Yugoslavia. And unfortunately, while the end of the Soviet Union didn't create a lot of wars, although there were a couple, Azerbaijan and Armenia, and problems in Georgia. Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia caused a lot of problems, and in many ways created the things that drove U.S. foreign policy, the Bosnian War, the Kosovo. Okay, what the Russians lost or perceived they lost at the end of the Cold War, they lost their empire, they lost parts of Russia themselves because they think Ukraine is part of Russia. I'm not saying that, that's just, and they lost the respect they had before as a great power. So there was, within Russia, a lot of discontent about what they had lost, and it remained for somebody to be able to encourage that discontent, and of course, his name was Vladimir Putin. Okay, now we finished part 1 about treatment of defeated adversaries. Part 2 is about U.S. foreign policy, realism versus idealism. And my definition, realism views world politics as an enduring competition among self-interested states vying for power and positioning in a system with no central authority. And that's how I view it. And idealism is to make its own moral and political philosophy the goal for other nations by, in this case, extending democracy. That is idealism, and I criticize it if we do not take into account that democracy doesn't fit everywhere, and in particular, to try to make Afghanistan or Iraq democracies was not a wise idea. Afghanistan we had to invade, but after about 6 months we had accomplished our real goal, and then we started to get carried away with the idea of making it democratic. Okay, my perception. Okay, now we're on to part 3, the Cold War, and this will be somewhat personal because I lived through it. And I want to establish the main points as clearly as I can, and then afterwards I will take a few questions in case I've been unclear. Questions, not statements, preferably short, but I have a lot of material I'm going to try to recover. Okay, in 1962 I graduated from high school. And then I went to college, and I'm sitting in a college cafeteria. I mentioned one member of my graduating class was a guy who wrote this book, Professor William Mills. So anyway, on October 22nd, I was sitting in a college cafeteria, and suddenly there's a booming voice of President John F. Kennedy. The Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba 90 miles off the US course. I was shocked along with the rest of the country. And there's Nikita Khrushchev. And this was his speech on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it says, Kennedy orders blockade of Cuba. As Reds build nuclear bases there, U.S. will sink defiant armed ships. And there's some of the rockets that were there, short-range rockets. So for 13 days in 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union were eyeball to eyeball, and the confrontation is widely considered the closest the Cold War ever came to escalating into full-scale nuclear war. President Kennedy declared a blockade. The Soviet Union removed the missiles. This was my introduction to world politics as a college freshman. Ooh, okay. And I'm going to go on to something. Wait a second, what happened? I missed a slide. Okay, maybe I didn't. Okay. A different matter before '62 was a very oddball thing happened, the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. So before talking further about the US-Soviet, I want to mention a little known event that meant almost nothing at the time, but had a large impact later. And I refer to an event in 1954, shortly after Stalin died, and while Georgy Malenkov was temporarily replacing Stalin as premier, it would eventually be Nikita Khrushchev who became first secretary of the Communist Party. And that struggle between Malenkov and Khrushchev was going on, and as part of it, Khrushchev arranged for the transfer of Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1954. This had absolutely no impact on the world at the time. However, it became important later when the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly Ukraine found itself with Crimea and the whole Russian fleet parked on its property, so to speak. And there was a negotiation, but that became a real problem, at least in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, which resulted in the fact that in 2014, well, here's what happened in 2014. The ultimate importance was that when Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was ousted from office on February 22nd, 2014, Russian President Putin quickly arranged to seize Crimea from Ukraine, beginning on the 27th. What he did, because he had 25,000 troops there, that's where the fleet was based, and that was allowed, but he just sent them out. They surrounded the Ukrainians who were there. Nobody had any idea this was happening, and he seized Crimea and then incorporated it as the Republic of Crimea. And that was also the time, I don't get into this, but it was also the time when the Donbass regions started their revolts. Again, this has to do with Yanukovych being removed from office, and the Russian population of Donbass was unhappy with that. And that began with revolts that were supposedly spontaneous, but there was a feeling that perhaps Putin was involved. Anyway, so we go from the nuclear standoff, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And between them, the Soviet Union and America faced each other with a capability to do immense damage to each other by nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had some 10,000 ICBMs pointed at the United States, and the United States had an equivalent capacity to destroy a large part of the Soviet Union. And believe it or not, this is true today. We lose sight of it, but here is something that I think is very interesting. And this happens to be figures from 2017, but this is the number of nuclear warheads inventory. And Russia had 6,800, US had 6,600. The third place was France with 300, the fourth place, China with 270, Britain with 215, Pakistan 140, India 130, Israel 80, North Korea 20. These numbers are sometimes guesswork. This is the upper limit of what people guess at. But that's what it was, what is that, 8 years ago. And now the big change, of course, has been China. China is building rapidly to try to come to equivalence. And I think this is serious business. And in fact, if I can just share a story from William Hill, a professor. He is a true Russia expert. I'll be explaining that. But he, among other things, lectures at the U.S. War College. You may or may not know that the United States has 5 war colleges: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and then the national one in Washington. So he's there in front of 220 some colonels and captains in the Navy, the people just below flag rank, just below generals and admirals. And at the end of his lecture on Russia, somebody raises their hand and says, "So why do we care about Russia?" And Hill said, "Because they're the only country on earth that has the capacity to obliterate the United States." And there was a, like a gasp. And of course, what that means is there were a whole lot of people in that room who just didn't fully understand the math. Yeah, that gasp indicated a lot of people just don't think about this. So if you want to know why President Biden was so careful about escalating, or anyway, there is a very real situation here to take into account. Okay, are we ready? And Russian history, Russian foreign policy. Russian history began in Kiev. This was a shock to me, but there was a Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev called Vladimir the Great, who ruled from 978 to 1015. And Russian history started in Kiev about 988. And here I'm quoting this Ryazanowski is sort of considered the historical expert on Russia. And I'm quoting him. "The Kievan Russians formally accepted Christianity from Constantinople in or around 988, and probably in or near Kiev." Okay? So we're going to be using, there was a 1,000th year anniversary of the Christianization of Russia, officially celebrated, including Gorbachev, by Russia in 1988. Gorbachev was still in power, but he allowed this 1,000-year anniversary to be celebrated, which might have had something to do with him losing power, because it was a very important religious moment. Okay, anyway, Russia started in Kiev. Then, for several hundred years, then the Mongols invaded, guided by Genghis Khan and his grandson Batu Khan, invaded the Kievan Rus starting about 1223, 13th century. That's Genghis Khan, and Kublai Khan, I think, might have been his grandson. But the Mongols ruled Russia for about 250 years, 13th to 15th centuries, until maybe 1480. And the Mongols are also called sometimes the Tatars or the Tartars. Sometimes they're called the Golden Horde. You hear all of these terms thrown around. But Mongol rule is regarded as having retarded the development of Russia, and Russia never forgets that invasion. They never forget any invasion, which is probably their right. Mongol rule ended with Muscovite control. Moscow was the center of the movement to kick the Mongols out. There's different dates that people use for when the Russians regained control. But now, instead of Kiev, it was Moscow that was the center of Russia, and I think has been since. Here's a couple of important people. Peter the Great, late 17th, early 18th century. Catherine the Great, middle to late 18th century. And then we had Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. And that got almost all the way to Moscow, but stopped basically by the weather. And of course, that's an important factor in Russian history, this huge invasion from the West. And then we had Hitler's invasion of Russia in 1941. Huge loss of servicemen for Russia. I'm going to get to that. But this is a map showing Hitler's invasion, and you can see they got almost all the way to Moscow, but were finally stopped, and again, the weather was helpful. Here I had American servicemen killed in World War II, 250,000, Russians 10 million, 40 times as many. Here's a map of contemporary Russia, and you can see that everything, this is Russia, but everything is on the west end, Moscow, St. Petersburg. And then I'm going to have another one. This is European Russia. And again, you can see like Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and then we've got all these Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Okay, I'm putting up this slide, and what it shows is of those 14 republics outside of Russia, what the percentage of ethnic Russians is. And I think that's the largest one. The smallest one is Armenia. And you can see from the size of the red slice how many ethnic Russians each of those 14 freed countries after 1991, what percentage are Russians? And this is percentage of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Okay, the one that's most interesting in Crimea. Crimea is 58% Russian ethnic. And but here is the Donbass, these two, 38%. Then the next one, these are close to the Donbass, 25%. And then we get down to, these are what, 10 to 20%, these are 5 to 10%, and the western part is 0 to 5% Russian. Again, just helping you envision, I mean, the claim of Putin is there's all these Russian ethnic people in Ukraine who are not being treated properly in his mind, meaning they don't obey him. Okay, so part 4 was a history of Russia, and in the context of the history of civilization. So why is Russia authoritarian? Because they've been that way for 1,000 years. Why is Russia so fearful of invasions to the point of being paranoid? They've gone through the Mongols, the French under Napoleon, and the Germans under Hitler. But how does Russian history differ from the history of Western nations, such as the United States? And this is going to be sort of interesting. We've answered two of the questions, but how does it differ from other history? Now, obviously, the United States has an enormous blessing called the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. We have not been invaded by anybody other than the British in the War of 1812. But Russia is in a very different situation. It's a huge country. I hope we saw that. And the whole southern border is wide open because it's these steppes, the plains. It's just grassland. And so if you're the Mongol hordes, you can just take all of your horses and camels and, there's nothing stopping you. But the difference goes far deeper than that. And I'm going to go back to the Roman Emperor Constantine, called the Great. He legalized Christianity in 313, but he also did something else that's very important. He split the Roman Empire into two halves. The eastern half, the Greek-speaking, which became known as the Byzantine Empire, and the western half, Latin-speaking, which is known as Western civilization. And in 391, Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion. That's Theodosius I. But what's really interesting, this is the division, and you can see he established a new capital of Russia at Constantinople that had been called Byzantium. He renamed it Constantinople. And so this eastern half is called the Byzantine Empire. But the western half still had its capital at Rome. And this was a very important division of the Roman Empire. We're going to see why. Constantine split the Roman Empire, moved his capital to Byzantium, renamed after him, and Constantinople became called the New Rome, because that's where the emperor was. And the two halves of the Roman Empire had very different histories, and you're going to see how this affects Russia. Now remember the Iron Curtain? This was the map of the Iron Curtain. And if you look at that, you realize it looks a lot like the split that Constantine made. In fact, it's the same. It's almost identical. And here's the division of the Roman Empire. You can see it's just to the right of Italy there. And here's the division of the Iron Curtain. And you can see again, it's to the right of it, And there's a connection here, and we're going to be talking about it. The divergent histories of East and West, and now I want to try to cover 1,600 years of history in just a few minutes. Okay. After 391, that's the split, the eastern and western halves had very different histories. The eastern half remained unified for over 1,000 years. That was the Byzantine Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, and it was finally conquered by Muslims in 1458 AD. Now, so that Eastern Byzantine Empire remained unified for over 1,000 years, but it was a top-down structure. This was the Roman Empire, authoritarian. It was authoritarian, that's it. And there was no separation of church and state. And that's true to this day. The Eastern Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox Church supports everything that Vladimir Putin says. There's no separation of church and state. And then, here's Byzantine architecture. This is a fantastic place, the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, built 537. But the western half of the Roman Empire had a very different experience. It was conquered by the Germanic, quote, barbarians. They weren't barbarian. But it developed the separation in church and state. Here's the sack of Rome in 410. And then a man named St. Augustine of Hippo wrote an influential book in AD 426 called The City of God, which became the basis for the separation of church and state. And so even though the Pope no longer controlled a lot of things, even in Rome, the church stayed unified from 426 all the way up to Martin Luther in 1517. You know, that was when the Protestant Reformation began. I should mention that the church, this is the Roman Catholic Church, split from Eastern Orthodox in 1054 AD. And then they pretty much remained separate after that. They talk about getting together every once in a while. But then in 1517, that was Martin Luther and the start of the Protestant Reformation. And this is St. Augustine of Hippo, the City of God, separation of church and state. So the western half of the Roman Empire disintegrated into feudalism, and then eventually the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation occurred, but church and state were separated. And I can go into that history, but I'm not going to do it right now. Okay? So in other words, the western half of what had been the Roman Empire became very much secularized and a separation of church and state, while the eastern half, and especially Moscow became called the Third Rome. Remember, Constantinople was the second. And then after Constantinople fell, Moscow called itself the Third Rome, like they considered themselves the top church in Eastern Orthodoxy. Constantinople survived until conquered by the Muslims in 1458. Constantinople passed its religion, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, to Russia in 988. Moscow began to call itself the New Rome, meaning the Third Rome, and there was no separation of church and state. So the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, had no Protestant Reformation, had no separation of church and state. It was authoritarian and passed that quality on to the New Rome, which was Moscow. Meanwhile, the western half was very different, especially after the Protestant Reformation in 1517 and the impact of the separation of church and state. And those differences are apparent in the map. You know, there's the Western Roman Empire versus the Byzantine Empire, and again, the same line, the Western democracies and many of the, especially Russia, autocracies or authoritarian countries. So the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire developed in very different ways. That's the end of part 4 of my presentation. What happened during the period following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991? What could or should have been done differently? And here I'm going to be following this guy. He was a classmate of mine, not that I knew him in high school, but his book is called No Place for Russia, came out in 2018, and actually he was the one who got me interested in this. Because we have reunions every 5 years, and the 55th reunion was in 2017. And at the reunion, each person was invited to present about something they were passionate about. And he was passionate about the book he was writing. So that's how I found out about his interest. And then the 60th reunion in 2022, happened to be a few months after Putin invaded. So I called him up, I said, would you like to present? And he said, yeah, he could do a PowerPoint. And then I did this PowerPoint, or a much earlier version of it. So this is just to our classmates at the reunion, you know. But I've been wanting to do this again, and today is my chance. So
Thank you for doing it.
Yeah.
what?
Thank you for doing it for us.
Well, it's a topic of great interest, and Americans, I would say most Americans are idealistic, so that means most people are not on the same wavelength as I am, because I'm a skeptic and a realist, but that's fine. And, you know, I'm not trying to push anybody to agree with me, it's just that, okay. While some may think the most important task in 1991 was the careful handling of Russia due to its large army and navy and a huge number of nuclear weapons, there were many, many distractions at the time. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were suddenly 14 new nations, some with long-standing conflicts with each other. Azerbaijan and Armenia were soon in conflict, as was Georgia and South Ossetia and Chechnya. You know, there's a lot of things going on apart from Yugoslavia. In addition, Yugoslavia began breaking apart at the same time, which brought another 6 new nations, which are Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Slovenia, and Montenegro. And the mishandling of these brought new problems, which included the Bosnian War, War in Kosovo, and the Serbian Commission of Massacres. So, and here you can see, there's Slovenia up at the top, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is Serbia, and Montenegro and Macedonia. So, that, you know, Ukraine was breaking apart and it wasn't as peaceful as the Soviet Union breaking apart. And there were 3 European security organizations, NATO, always the preferred group for the Americans, the European Union, usually preferred by Europeans, that was an economic one, but they started to get into the security business. And then OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was the preferred group for the Russians, because it was the only one on which they were represented. And OSCE, and I didn't put this here, but Professor William Hill was at several points in charge of running that, you know, in the Foreign Service. He was given that task, and so he did have a lot of, he saw all of these things happening. He was also the special representative to Moldova. During this extremely difficult and conflicted time, this is the Boris Yeltsin years and beyond, nearly all decisions wound up being made in NATO or the EU, where Russia was not represented. And the Russians felt very much disrespected by that. And there were major issues about the breakup of Yugoslavia in which the Russians were very interested, because the Serbs in particular were Eastern Orthodox with the Russians. So anyway, at the time I did this lecture back in 2022, I decided I'm going to try to figure out Yugoslavia and the Balkans. And I spent so much time and I gave up. No, it is just so, there's so many feuds, and you know, the Serbs have feuds going back to the 12th century, you know, and it's like, you almost want to say, you know, can't we get past that? Or,
Yeah.
but it's easy for us to say, but anyway, the biggest issue for the Russians was the expansion of NATO to the east. The Russians believed, that Gorbachev, had a promise from American Secretary of State James Baker that once East Germany joined NATO, which was a big thing to swallow for them, there would be no further additions. Well, that had been stated, and Baker admits he said it, but never put into treaty language or legally passed. And very soon, NATO began expanding eastward to the enormous displeasure of the Russians, because it was very easy for people in Russia, especially the more conservative or authoritarian faction, to treat this as being a pincer move, squeezing them. And of course, the big medulla was Ukraine. When Ukraine started talking about joining NATO, it was like, Putin exploded, and that was, I can pretty much guarantee you there's going to be no settlement that has Ukraine and NATO if Trump is able to get any settlement. So that's, for Putin. And this is what Professor Wilhelm says. In my view, no single act or policy caused or explains Europe's current divisions and instability after such an optimistic end to the Cold War. The story I tell in these pages is one of many decisions and actions that seemed to make great sense at the time, may have even enjoyed success, but also had second-order unintended impacts that led to the current. In other words, taking more and more decisions in the EU or in NATO where Russian interests were not taken into account. And of course, that caused a reaction from the Russians. The basic argument in this volume is neither Russia, the major European powers, nor the US have been successful since 1989 in defining a place for Russia in the European or Euro-Atlantic security architecture, or in integrating Russia into the major European security institutions. To make this case, I examined the development of NATO, the EU, and the OSCE from 1989 to the present. So I recommend this book if you find yourself interested in this period. I think he's a very even-handed, and one of the biggest problems here was Yugoslavia. As he says, alas, Yugoslavia was not fated to experience a miracle similar to the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. And here he's talking about Yugoslavia now. Despite Russia's involvement in brokering a ceasefire and initial involvement in the peacekeeping operation in Kosovo, the 1999 NATO war against Serbia-Montenegro also produced confrontation, ultimately lasting disagreement between Russia and the major Western powers. In other words, that was really the point at which things got broken. So now I'm going to talk about further research, and I think we passed this out, but I always advise people to read Herodotus and Thucydides. Okay, the real book about realism, if you're interested, is by Hans Morgenthau, called Politics Among Nations. I like the 1967 fourth edition, but none of those are an easy read. Now, if you want a fairly easy read, here's the book you want. It's going to be two books. Henry Kissinger, called The World Order. I'm not a big fan of Kissinger, but this is very clear, straightforward, and readable. And the other book is Charles Krauthammer, Things That Matter. And Krauthammer gets the things right that Kissinger gets wrong, in my opinion. And finally, this book, No Place for Russia. So, thank you.
Thank you.